Welcome to In Conversation With, a series of programs presented by the Council of State Archivists that focus on contemporary issues shaping the work of state archives and records programs. My name is Ann Ackerson, and I serve as the Communications and Development Coordinator for the Council. We're delighted that the series this year is being supported by our corporate sponsor, Atlas Systems. Over the course of 2021, the conversations in this series will span three broad topics: diversity and inclusion, the workplace here and now, and the future of work and the workplace. Today, I'm joined by Rick Hendricks, New Mexico State Records Center Administrator and Chair of the New Mexico State Historical Records Advisory Board. We'll be discussing how he and his agency approach working with Indigenous populations, of which there are many in New Mexico. So thank you so much for being here, Rick.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Before we jump into talking about how to build and maintain successful relationships with Native communities, I'd like to ask you if you'd tell us a little bit about yourself and your career journey. And for example, what brought you to your current position from the State Historian's Office?
Well, to back up just a little bit, I spent 27 years in the university system in New Mexico at the University of New Mexico, primarily. That's where I did my PhD, but I did a long-term historical editing project, the papers of Don Diego de Vargas, 17th century governor of New Mexico. Then I went to New Mexico State University and I worked in the archives there for about 17 years. One of the main projects that we did there was the Durango Cathedral Archives from Durango, Mexico. We had a project where we microfilmed about 1 million pages of material related to the Southwest and Northern Mexico and brought that. So I worked on that project. Then I became state historian of New Mexico and did that for 9 years. And we had a vacancy for the head of the agency. And because I'd worked here for a long time and I had a lot of experience working in archives, it seemed like something I might enjoy doing. So I became a bureaucrat.
Right.
And that's really what brought me to this position.
Right.
And so I've been doing this now for almost 2 years. So that gives me just under 38 years working for New Mexico in one capacity or another.
And I know, because we've previously talked about it a little bit, that you've over that time, you have built really solid relationships with many of the Indigenous Native communities in the state. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I wonder if you would kind of give us a brief overview of the Indigenous groups in New Mexico and how you and your agency work with them.
So we have 23 different tribal groups in New Mexico. We have 19 Pueblo communities. We have 3 Apache groups. And then we have part of the Navajo Nation is located in New Mexico. So an abundance of sovereign nations. And we work with them in a number of different ways. I would say that the primary contact that we have with the Native communities is through our SHRAB. Through the years, we've had many of the Pueblos have applied for and received grants. And so we've helped them with initiating archival programs, records management programs, specific preservation activities that they've been involved in. We just have recently had a program with Zuni Pueblo, which is in the far eastern part of New Mexico, for them to do an assessment of their collection. Almost every year we have at least one applicant for one of the grants that is from one of the Native communities. We always try to have a tribal member on the board. We don't currently have one, but in most years we try to have a tribal member. We work with the Institute of American Indian Arts here in Santa Fe. We have a memorandum of understanding with them, and we've had activities that we've hosted there, or we've hosted their students here. I'm going to be giving a talk on our archival program to them in March. And then the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, which has representatives from all the tribal communities. It's a museum. It's also a cultural institution. We've frequently had staff members from there that have been either on our board or worked with us. That entity has received grants as well. And then our archives program itself provides consultation frequently with groups. We've had Pueblo communities come in and consult with the state archivist about setting up a program. And a number of years ago, we took in a collection that actually belongs to one of the Pueblos, documents that date back to the early 18th century. And those we're housing here. The tradition in the Pueblo was that they resided in a box, and then they passed from governor to governor once a year. And we were able to persuade them that we could provide climate controlled conditions to keep the documents safe here. Those are technically on loan here, which we don't normally do, but because of the unique opportunity to serve that community and also provide access to scholars to those documents, we agreed to do that. So those are sort of the ways that we institutionally that we've done it. Now, personally, for my entire career, both as a historian and in the archives world, I've worked with Native communities, written several books and articles about Native communities. So I have a personal relationship with quite a few of them.
Right.
So that's pretty much sort of how we work with them and how they are spread through the state. Most of those communities are in the northern part of the state.
And because they're sovereign entities, I suppose that, well, I shouldn't suppose, you should tell me, does your agency end up working with them one-on-one individually, or do you have opportunities to work collectively with more than one community?
I suppose you could say that through the Institute of American Indian Arts or through the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, we have an opportunity to work more collectively. But through the grant program, we're working one-on-one with a Pueblo typically, and so that will involve obviously the application process, making recommendations for individuals who could work with them if they don't have anybody on staff. We just received word that we'd received funding for the next 2 year for our SHRAB, and we are instituting a traveling archives program for the first time. And we think that will also be, I suppose if the pandemic allows us to actually have somebody travel, or maybe it'll be a virtual traveling, that will also enable us to reach Native communities in a way that we haven't been able to before.
Are there broadband issues? I mean, if you can't travel.
New Mexico does have some broadband issues, but some of the Pueblo communities haven't put an emphasis on access to that. So that remains to be seen. I would say, generally speaking, our infrastructure here is really good along the I-25 corridor north-south. And some of our rural areas actually have really good Wi-Fi, but some don't. That'll be something that we will have to deal with. But again, that's something new for us that we're going to hopefully try this time around.
Right.
We need some applicants. So,
right. Yeah. First things first, right?
first things first, right?
Right. Since we're kind of already talking a little bit about opportunities and challenges, are there other kinds of opportunities and challenges that you see or you faced with your outreach to the state's Native communities?
Well, I mean, some of the issues that we have are that uh, tribal communities tend to change their government every January. That's the typical process. So um, when an applicant say they already have an archival program and they want to do something with it, they want to rehouse material or whatever, they have to go through a process to get approval at within their local government before they can apply. So that can be a little bit of a challenge for them. And then, for example, for us to keep some sort of continuity with an individual community, it's a little bit difficult because oftentimes the person who will be the representative for the community, maybe in a cultural capacity or an archival capacity, that individual might also change.
Right.
So that sort of nature of their internal government presents us a challenge. And then we have just sort of the issue, and I know we're going to discuss this later, but there's the issue of establishing trust with the communities that is really important, and that can be challenging as well. For example, typically NHPRC requires that material that are used has to be made available to the public, and ideally now that would be on the internet. Well, because we're dealing with sovereign nations and access to material that they consider to be culturally sensitive, they can't do that. They're not willing to do that. Right. It's a cultural value that they have that we have to respect. So explaining that whole process, that yes, they are eligible for the grants. It can also be a little bit of a challenge because the general idea is to keep information for the tribe. For example, we worked with Taos Pueblo on their individual land records within the community, and that was. It was a very successful project, but it was a project where that information was not going to be available to anybody other than the Pueblo. So those kinds of things function a little bit differently from, I mean, typically the state archive, I mean, what we're trying to do is provide access to all our material. Sort of the whole focus is access. Right. And for them, a lot of times the focus is really preservation and access, but access for tribal members. So right. It can be a little bit different.
So that collection you mentioned a bit earlier that you have on loan,
yes,
is a collection that would not be accessed by the public, by the general public. It's
no, that collection can be accessed.
Oh, really? Oh,
it's a unique situation. We've never really had a collection that has been made available in that way. So the decision that the tribal government made was that very generously they would allow those documents to be consulted by scholars. Prior to that, in the entire period that they had them, and they've had them since I think the earliest document is from 1706. Only a handful of non-Pueblo people had ever been allowed to consult those documents. So for them to agree to allow those, to put those in the collection where people could actually consult them, it was pretty special for us to be able to do that. And we have had scholars consult those.
Wow.
And it provides a view of the Pueblo and how they acquired land, how they protected their land in a way that's pretty unique, because normally we don't have access to that kind of internal
Mhm.
material. So
Mhm.
that was very special. And when that decision was made to let those documents be here, members of the tribal council came and met with our commission. So it was quite a little celebration.
Mhm. That's really, that is special, isn't it?
And we have sort of a standing offer, because most of the documents, obviously, the old documents are written in Spanish of the 17th or 18th century. And many times a tribal community won't have anyone who can read those documents. So
Mhm.
I and the current state historian have sort of a standing offer to transcribe and translate those documents. So far, no one has taken this up on it, but the offer is out there, should anybody want to do that. So,
Right. That's really great. Opportunities, I suppose, for, for building or strengthening relationships, I suppose in this period when we're all faced with kind of financial constraints and are not being able to have enough staff and that sort of thing, probably kind of really constrict opportunities. But what do you see either now or on the horizon that you or your agency might be able to do with Native communities?
well, we're very optimistic that the traveling archive program will present an opportunity. And what we really would love to see happen would be, so one of the issues that we have in New Mexico, I suppose you could call it an opportunity, is that we don't currently have a program, either library science or with anything like that with an archival specialization. We don't have any program like that at all.
Mm.
We would love to get somebody from a Native community involved, and fill that role.
Mhm, mhm.
So that would be something that we are looking for, trying to identify people in those communities. I know that the Institute of American Indian Arts, that the archivist there, Ryan Flahive, he is on our board, the SHRAB board. And so as he works with and trains people in his facility, we're hoping that we can identify some people that that would be native and would be interested in becoming archivists, and that could go
Mhm.
out into that community. Now, some of them already have native. Isleta Pueblo, south of Albuquerque, has an archival program and a records management program, and those are all native folks.
Sure.
So that would be a real opportunity, I think, that we would like to see. Um, Currently, I think the University of Arizona is probably the closest place where somebody could go and get that training.
Mhm.
Um, and we would certainly encourage folks to do that. And of course, the dream would be for us to have a program here, either at the University of New Mexico, which would probably be the logical place, or
Yeah.
but to have a state with nobody training librarians or archivists is it's really difficult.
Mhm.
And as I'm sure many people know, it's very challenging for us to attract people to come to work here. Uh,
Mhm.
we have
Yeah.
quite a challenge in getting archivists to come work. And of course, being
Mhm.
state government, we don't offer really competitive salaries.
Mhm.
And I think in general, the profession is undervalued. So I think
Yeah, I would say
in
that.
general, I
Right.
think that for what people contribute to the communities at large, um,
Yeah.
the starting salaries for archivists is pretty embarrassing.
Mhm.
You go through all
Mhm.
that training and then you get out and it's like, well,
Mhm. Right.
not very attractive. So that's an issue that
Right.
we have. I suppose it's an opportunity too, but don't know what the solution is right now.
Right. Well, you're not alone, certainly. I think many other state archives and record centers struggle with the same issue.
Yeah.
They're oftentimes not even located in or near a major city the way you are.
Right.
They can be really in rural areas. And I think those often can be a tough sell.
Well, for
as you
example,
say.
to come here, right,
Yeah,
Santa Fe is by far our most expensive
Yeah.
city.
yeah,
That's where the state archives is located. And so
Yeah.
when you ask somebody to come here, you're also saying, yes, we're not going to be able to pay you what you're worth, but in addition, it's going to cost you more to live here than it would anywhere else in the state.
or you've got a really long commute every day.
Or you've got a long commute, which a lot of people do.
I bet they do.
You know, a lot of people commute from Albuquerque, and even though you know you could commute farther than that in any major city, it's still pretty brutal because it's like a raceway on the interstate. You know, I mean,
Mhm.
people who do that all the time, it really burns them out.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, you mentioned the trust issue, and that is one of the questions that I wanted to talk about,
right.
because it is an issue. I think anyone working with Native communities or any kind of underserved community, issues of trust really are deep, they're embedded.
Right.
And so talk a little bit about the kind of trust issues that you've faced and how you've dealt with them.
So I would think, just generally speaking, the main issue that we have is that when you're dealing with Native communities and you are representing state government, um, there have been so many issues over time where it's been confrontational. Um, the sovereign Pueblo or Apache Nation dealing with the state government. So when you come as representative of the government, there's sort of a natural distrust there, and it's completely understandable. Um, in New Mexico, we have, as many Native communities, we have casinos. Most of the communities operate casinos, and so that's a particular issue that the tribes have with state government, negotiating over the operation of them, because from a strictly tribal sovereignty standpoint, they really shouldn't have to, they would say that really shouldn't have to negotiate anything, right?
That's
They
right.
should be able to operate
Yeah.
any other way. So that's an issue. So as a representative of the government, because the primary way that we deal with them is providing grants for starting their programs, expanding their programs, developing their programs. You typically, we have an individual dealing with the representative from the tribe. Now, we've been blessed, I can say, for many years by having people who were already very well respected in the tribal communities that have wanted to work with the SHRAB in order to help those. So Dr. Willow Powers, who has passed away, was an anthropologist and also an archivist, and volunteered countless hours working with Pueblo communities. And also, I believe she worked with Navajo, but through her personal integrity, her respect for the issues that were important to the tribes, she was able to go into the tribal communities and say, this program, which is a federal program administered by the state, is actually trying to help, and that at every step of the way will be respectful for your wishes. And that can be from, you know, who can perform a site visit, how the site visit would be conducted, the reporting requirements, all of those types of things. We have to identify someone there that we can work with. And again, we're fortunate. We typically have board members who are working in tribal communities in some capacity, or for an entity that works with them, or are themselves tribal members. I would certainly encourage, I mean, maybe this is common, but if you have tribal communities in your state, and you are administering a SHRAB program, getting a tribal member on the board is probably one of the most important things you can do.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have a lot of underserved Hispanic communities, but we really don't have a challenge in getting qualified Hispanics to serve on our boards and commissions. It's a little bit more difficult sometimes for the tribal communities to provide someone. But again, we've been very fortunate. That's absolutely crucial. And I think the other thing is that it really is personal. You have to develop a personal relationship. I've been fortunate. I've worked with Pueblo communities, both in New Mexico and also in Texas, for my entire career. So they know me, they know my work. And that's very important, developing the personal relationships. It's also the case that sometimes there will be, you will seem like you're making progress with a particular group, and then the applications don't come in. And so it also requires patience, because sometimes it's just a little bit different situation. And because they have to go into their home community and really get buy-in to what it is they're proposing to do. And I think sometimes there's a challenge there that we're not really aware of that's going on, because somebody might say, well, why would we want to bring in outsiders to help?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me one of the keys to success is meeting tribes where they are, and really listening to what their needs are, and certainly not coming in with some prescribed plan. Here it is, we have all the answers and we're going to lay it on you here. And
right. I mean, exactly. What we encourage them to do is to work with a consultant if they don't have somebody that's already on staff. And because New Mexico attracts a lot of young anthropologists and archaeologists and people like that, it's very common to find that someone who has worked in doing their graduate work, for example, in one of those fields, will be working with the Pueblo, will have worked with them for a number of years and gained confidence of the people, that they're trustworthy scholars. And then those people will end up coming to us and saying, this Pueblo has this amazing resources. They're housed in a building that, they're not organized. They're at risk. And so we get that. Actually is fairly common. The program that we have been doing with Zuni Pueblo, that was initially to do an assessment of their collection. The collection was at risk. They brought in a scholar from Utah that had a lot of experience doing assessments of collections. They brought that individual in. But the reason that they came to us was because a recent PhD who had done his field work there at the Pueblo and had established a good rapport with them, was able to persuade them that it would be in their interest to approach us and then the other thing that we can do there is that one grant can build on another grant,
Right.
and
Yeah.
oftentimes that's our grants are relatively small, will serve to be sort of a feeder to another
Mhm.
grant
Mhm.
situation. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's.
Do you see your agency's relationship with the communities changing over time as you look to the future?
I think that in the next 2-year period, it will expand because we received a much more generous grant. Um, and it really is, sometimes it's just about the dollars. I mean,
Mhm. Mhm.
the the reality is that some people won't go through the process of applying for a grant because they look and they see that, well, it's really not all that much money.
Mhm.
And there's a lot to the application.
Very true.
What
Yeah.
they usually discover, though, is that it opens up a whole universe of people who can provide assistance to them. Um, Once we sort of plug somebody into a consultant, um, they find out that there are a lot more things that they might be interested in doing, for example.
Mhm. For sure.
And so I think that since our trained archivists in New Mexico are kind of thin on the ground, getting them in touch with people. And I think also for people who
Yeah.
do that kind of consulting, a lot of them aren't really aware of the opportunities that are out there, that we have 23 sovereign nations, all of whom are producing government documents, and most all of them
Mhm.
have
Mhm.
documents of historical value. Um, there's actually a lot of opportunity that way as well. Um,
For sure.
so
Do any
that's.
of the tribes employ their own archivists?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Oh, okay. And you may have said that earlier, and I didn't catch it.
Yes. In fact, most of them have someone that is at least beginning to do that kind of work.
I see.
Right. It may be somebody who is in the tribal office who has
Mm.
been given the task of
Mhm.
keeping track of the material. Um, but most of them are starting to develop much more fully developed programs. And of course, these are 21st century governments, and
True.
they are producing a lot of material. And um, because of their economic activity, with their involvement with casinos and that sort of thing, these are highly sophisticated government operations, and they're
Mhm.
producing a lot of material. And what is of interest to me as a Spanish colonial historian is that a lot of them actually have documents that date way, way back, and to the extent that they're willing to, um, even if all they do is preserve the material and they're not willing to share it, that makes me happy to know that it's in, it's in a Hollinger box. It's in
Yes.
an
Right.
acid-free folder. It's living the way it needs to live,
Yes.
um, and that is happening, and I think that will continue to happen. And again, I think the fact that we have more resources will mean that we can touch more
Mhm.
communities.
Mhm. For sure. Right. And is there any thought of bringing those folks together who are responsible for their tribes archives, and maybe this already exists, together in some sort of an affinity group for them to share knowledge
So
about their work?
what we've talked about, and we haven't um, brought this to fruition primarily because of what happened with the pandemic, but um, I mentioned Ryan Fleihive, who's at IAI. When he was in Arizona, and Arizona has a very active group where they have all the archivists uh, that get together.
Hmm.
And he had suggested that we do the same thing here.
Hmm.
We already have an organization of tribal librarians, So I think that, and in some cases that may even be the same person.
Right.
And that's run out of the state library, which happens to be in the same physical facility that we're in. So we're hoping that we can do two things. One, have an organization, even if it's fairly loosely organized, but that would bring together archivists from around the state, but also that would be able to draw in the tribal people. I think it's quite doable. And hopefully as soon as we get beyond the pandemic, we would be able to do that. I mean, I've dealt personally with a number of them. The archivist that is at Isleta Pueblo, because I've worked a lot with that Pueblo, they have a very nice facility there, and they actually started a program with us, and then I believe they're expanding their archival capacity and their records management program. I think they recently got an FMLA grant, but anyway, they're really moving along, and I think you'll see more of that as they share information. And the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, they have a staff there. They have an archive, a very nice archive there. They have it's staffed by native archivists, and so I think all of those programs will grow. I think once they sort of see the advantage to them, and that's an interesting facility to go to, because you can be looking at a collection and then they'll say, you can't look at the rest of that collection because that collection is for tribal members only. So it's, it's very well organized. It's on their own terms. It's perfectly open to the public, but there are materials that, say photographs that would depict a dance or something. They might say that's off limits, but it's in every sense a modern archive. It's just that it has restrictions. But I mean, we have restrictions too. I mean, we had a horrendous prison riot here one time, and the photographs are not anything you would want to see, but you can't see them anyway. So, so there are things like that. All archives have that, but so, yeah.
Interesting. So let's talk about strategies that you've used successfully to initiate or strengthen existing relationships, and what kind of advice would you give to your colleagues around the country in state archives and in record centers, either to initiate or to strengthen already existing relationships with Native communities?
So again, I mean, I guess I can't stress enough trying to establish personal relationships. Get yourself out there. Be willing to go to those communities. I think that's really important. We try to do an archival visit to any of those communities where it's appropriate, and we also invite people in. I think that's also important. One of the ways that you can really sell somebody on having a program, if they don't have one, is to bring them into your facility and show them, here's what it could look like for you. This is how we store documents. This is how we provide access to documents. And we have the state library. We have a regular archival vault, and then we have sort of the inner sanctum where we have our really, really old and valuable documents. And then we have a giant record center facility. So when you bring somebody on this campus and give them a tour, and the folks in archives are really great about giving tours of the facility and explaining all the different things. But a lot of people, just the simple things like this is an archival box, right? This is a acid-free folder. This is acid-free paper. This is why you would want to, this is what you want to do with just really basic stuff. And then
Right.
we talk about the climate control and the humidity control and all those things that we're doing. And obviously we encourage people to take those kind of things into consideration when they're planning. I mean, some of them are fortunate enough where they can actually say, well, we're going to have a building built. And so, for example, as Letta Pueblo, we've consulted with them a lot about here are considerations that you would want to make if you are fortunate enough to build a building, or if you're adapting a building. So, we have people with years and years of expertise, and I think sharing that, getting it out there. We have had invited people who have conducted successful programs to come give presentations and to give presentations to potential applicants. Sometimes that's better than anything we can say, to say, here's somebody who had a good experience. Here's where they were, here's where they are now. And most of the time, they're very willing to do that. So that word of mouth is really important too, within those communities, encouraging those people to share their experiences. It is really important. But I think the main thing that you can really do is get yourself out there. That's the most important thing. And we have a very small staff, and we lost our grants administrator. So right now, our state historian is acting as grants administrator. And of course, that's a challenge. He's now wearing two hats, and but maybe one day we'll be able to hire another one. Right. And so that's another thing, if you're fortunate enough to have somebody dedicated to the grants program. Oftentimes I think it's sort of catch as catch can. But in our case, we had a grants administrator. That was a full-time job for him. And so he could go out into the communities and he could talk to the communities. Spent a lot of time on the phone, sent a lot of emails. He tried to stay in contact with them all the time. And that's another thing that I think is important, especially for the tribal communities, is follow up and follow up and follow up, because sometimes it's a new experience for them. And so call them, ask them how they're doing, and that sort of thing.
Well, and as you said, we often don't have an idea of the various layers of bureaucracy within the tribe that someone has to work with in order to make things happen at their end.
And it's also the case that oftentimes the person who is the archivist is non-native. And so they have a whole different level of situation that they have to deal with, because they have to sort of negotiate that position as well. But increasingly, I think what we're going to see is highly trained Native folks, young folks who are enthusiastic, and I think that's going to be the wave of the future.
Well, I sure hope that someday you'll be able to get a training program off the ground for Native, potential Native archivists. I think that would be terrific.
Yeah, I think it would. Yeah,
I don't think it exists anywhere in the country. Do you? In Canada, even?
I'm not sure. If I had to say, I would say the most likely place that would be able to do that would be Arizona.
Yeah.
Not only do they have a lot of tribal communities, but they have a lot of programs that cater specifically to Indigenous communities, and not just from here, Indigenous communities from all over the world that go there and study programs that are specifically designed to meet the needs of those communities. And then the idea is that people take their advanced learning, and they go back into those communities. So it would seem to me that if it doesn't already exist, which I'm not aware that it does, that would be the logical place that would happen. Obviously, it would be fantastic if we could get something in the state, but Arizona is not that far away, and they do really. We have a number of outstanding Native people who have got advanced degrees from the University of Arizona and that have come back, and they do have training programs. You can get MLS degrees and that sort of thing over there. And I'm not sure about archival specialization, but I know that you can at least get your foot in the door. And I think that will happen. And I think that's what should happen, because somebody from that community is really going to better understand the special needs of that community.
For sure.
And they're all different. They are 23 very different communities.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think it's amazing that you've been able to work with so many of them and that they seem to communicate with each other. And given the fact that they are each different and their own entity.
Well, they have very good organizations that bring them all together, and an entity like IAI or the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, it gives them an opportunity to all get together and to talk. But the Pueblos community, getting together, the leadership of the community dates for over 300 years. It's something they've always done. And so I think that it's just a matter of saying, well, here are things that we might be able to do to help you. You tell us how we can do it. And like I say, we have most years, we have one or more Pueblo communities that will at least explore the opportunity of applying for a grant. They don't always do it, but there's an interest, there's a knowledge about how these programs can help them. And it continues. I'm optimistic that when we put out our call for applications, we'll have more communities that will come in this time as well.
Well, and that's really the proof of the pudding is is how they show up, which is really great. Anything else you want to add, Rick, that we haven't covered?
I'm just rambling.
No, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And I do think that your colleagues around the country will really appreciate what you've talked about and the advice that you've given for them. I'm sure there are many of them who have great relationships with their Native communities as well.
I'm sure.
But I bet they're all different, just as so many things among the states are different. So
I think that's probably true. I think that it's sort of a unique situation that we have in New Mexico, that we have so many different thriving indigenous communities, and sometimes the way they've taken these programs on and moved on. I'm really excited to see what the new facility will look like in Isleta Pueblo when they get it finished. They've gone around, as many Pueblos have, and they've gone to other repositories and gotten copies of, anthropologists were wonderful for taking pictures that maybe they weren't supposed to, but anyway, captured images. And so they've gone around and they've collected all these amazing images. Pewaukee Pueblo, north of Santa Fe, has done the same thing. And they just have this almost comprehensive collection of images that have been done. And really would take somebody from the Pueblo to identify what they were. And that's one of the really interesting things about it. It's like, a lot of times the identification doesn't exist anymore. Nobody really knows, what is this an image of? And they'll say, well, that's an image of a rabbit hunt or something. It was like, they still know because that cultural information is retained and it's passed on. And so what they're able to add to in terms of what they have in their collections, the collections that they're building, is really, it's amazing. It's unique because the knowledge is it's handed down in a different way. You can't just go pull it off a shelf and understand it. And so, and I'm sure that's true for all, you know, anybody who is fortunate enough to work with tribal communities has that experience, that there's just something special about when they're working with their own material and what it means to them, and how they can explain it, if they choose to.
So in addition to the written word, there's also photographic images,
gosh, yeah,
moving images, perhaps,
everything,
and recorded images. I mean, not recorded images, but recorded sound. Yep,
there's all sorts of materials of that nature. For example, W.D. Griffith made a movie here in New Mexico, and it's really interesting to see that movie interpreted by Native people, because what's in that movie and what was supposed to be depicted in that movie, if you just watched it, you would carry something away from that. But if you had somebody interpreting that for you, you'd say, oh, this is actually something very different was going on than what I thought was going on, and probably what the filmmaker thought was going on. So there are a lot of interesting things like that. And there's actually a lot of footage and probably millions of photographs, I would guess, that have been taken over the years. So, yeah.
Very cool. Well, Rick Hendricks, it's been a real pleasure to chat with you today and to pick your brains about this. It's a compelling topic, I think, and hopefully is talked about, but maybe isn't talked about enough. And so maybe this conversation we're having will kick off some conversations in state archives across the country as to how they might however they might, strengthen those relationships with their Native communities would be really great. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay.